What has Athens to do with Jerusalem? The original question by Tertullian is rhetorical in nature, but it's one theologians, philosophers, and historians have wrestled with for years. I certainly won't endeavor to answer the question today, but I'd like to narrow it down. Did Jesus use any Greek Hellenistic methods as he made disciples? It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you today. I want to congratulate the organizers of this conference. I think it's a very worthwhile and valuable endeavor, and I'm very privileged to be a part of it. So thank you. I am neither a philosopher nor a historian. Usually I would be among the presenters towards the end of this conference who are talking about discipleship and missions or observations that I've made as an American in Croatia. Yet the more I study how Jesus made disciples, the more I'm taken by this question of how Jesus' way of discipling was similar or different than the models around him. And so this question I began with is an itch that I've been wanting to scratch for a little while now, and this presentation is the result. What I'd like to do is look at whether Greek Hellenistic thought had any influence on Rabbinic Judaism, the culture in which Jesus made his own disciples, and then even if Greek Hellenistic thought influenced Rabbinic Judaism, did it in fact have an influence on Jesus? I want to point to a very specific way in which we see Jesus incorporating a Greek Hellenistic tool called Socratic interrogation in his ministry. First, two caveats. First of all, while I believe it's very clear that Greek Hellenistic pedagogical methods did influence Rabbinic Judaism, I'm not arguing for any sort of syncretism. In other words, I'm arguing that Greek pedagogy influenced the method, not the content of what Jesus taught. However, keeping this in mind, when we ask how Jesus made disciples, we are actually very interested in the method that Jesus used. And this is where I believe the question that we're asking is really important. How did Jesus make disciples? Part of his method was indeed influenced by Greek pedagogical methods. We will look at a very concrete example in a minute. The second caveat is I want to make it very clear that I am in no way diminishing the vital influence of the Hebrew Bible on the New Testament. From the opening words of Matthew to the last words of Revelation, the Old Testament is interwoven with the good news of the New Testament. So, in emphasizing the Greek influence on Jesus' methods, I am in no way diminishing Jesus' identity as a Jew, his role as the Jewish Messiah, or the numerous ways in which Jesus fulfills Jewish prophecy. Nor would I deny that we as Christians find our roots in Abraham the Hebrew. I can still sing the song, Father Abraham, with gusto at our kids' camps. Because I don't believe that these two are mutually exclusive. So, what is one way in which Greek pedagogical... Not sure how to use this. Am I using the correct one? I don't see another one. Are you able to change the one? What is one way in which Greek pedagogical methods influenced Rabbinic Judaism and therefore Jesus? In his book, The New Testament and Rabbinic Judaism, scholar David Daub relates Socratic interrogation to rabbinic methods in the first century. And Socratic interrogation has four main parts. First of all is a hostile question by an outsider. Second is a reply sufficient to defeat him. Third is a request by the inner circle for the true reply. And then finally is the true reply. And Daub, in his research, demonstrates a second century debate between Governor Rufus and Rabbi Akiba regarding the difference between the seventh day and other days. And this debate clearly shows the four main components of Socratic interrogation. For the sake of time, though, we will look at how Matthew and Luke portray Jesus' use of this method. In Matthew 21:23, we can see the conversation. Before we look at the text, though, a little bit of context. Jesus has just entered Jerusalem. Matthew tells us that the whole city was stirred up. Jesus cleanses the temple, he curses the fig tree, and the chief priests and the elders of the people stand up and challenge Jesus' authority. So that's the key question here, Jesus' authority. Now let's break this down. First of all, we have the hostile question. By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? This is Socrates' hostile question. Jesus is being challenged. And then Jesus responds with a question of his own, and if they can answer it, he will answer them. Jesus has the counter question. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from man? And so this is the Socratic reply sufficient to defeat them. And we see that because of this confusion between them, in fact, Jesus has already made his point here. We're only in the second step of the Socratic interrogation, and Jesus has already made the point. If they answer that John the Baptist got his authority from heaven, then Jesus will ask why they didn't believe him. If they answer from man, they're afraid of the crowd because they held him to be a prophet. So the chief priests and the elders are already stuck in the second step of Socrates' interrogation. And it's here where this method can be so greatly appreciated. Jesus' authority has now been more firmly founded than when they started questioning him. See, we all probably remember Jesus told the 11 disciples at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And so Jesus could have responded to the chief priests and elders this way, with a proposition, with a statement, with a teaching, with an answer. But instead, he let them figure it out logically by asking a question. So they answer, we do not know. This is the third part. And then Jesus makes the final true reply. Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. His opponents are refuted. The implication being that Jesus' authority is no less valid than John the Baptist's claims. So again, Jesus' claim to authority is more securely founded than when this conversation began. And I can't emphasize the point enough that Jesus very well could have made a proposition. He could have said all authority had been given to him, just as he did after his resurrection. Or Matthew could have just noticed that some of the people recognized his authority, just as he did after Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. In other words, Jesus could have established his authority without using the Socratic interrogation method. And Matthew didn't have to include this narrative in order to portray Jesus' authority or his conflict with the religious leaders. Yet, both Jesus and Matthew did use this method. There's obvious use of the Greek pedagogical method in Jesus' ministry, and it's not just Matthew who portrays this. Let's look at one more example in Luke. Luke 7:36 through 47. And the context here is that Jesus is reclining at table with a Pharisee. And all of a sudden the woman, who the Pharisee notices is a sinner, begins to anoint Jesus' feet with the ointment and her tears. We're probably all aware of this narrative, right? So we begin with the hostile question. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is and who is touching him, for she is a sinner. Jesus has the counter question. He says, he replies to this question, says, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher. And then he gives a short parable, right? And at the end of this parable, Jesus asks the question, now which of them will love him more? So this is the counter question. Simon replies, the one, I suppose, for whom he had canceled the larger debt. And notice here we don't see any deliberation like we saw in the previous narrative. Jesus had already made his point. Simon had already answered his own question with the help of the Socratic method. And then Jesus finishes with the true reply. You have judged rightly. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven. For she loved much, but he who's forgiven little loves little. And so this final part accords with a Greek rhetorical rule, as Aristotle points out. Again, interrogation should be employed when one of the two propositions is evident and it is obvious that the opponent will admit the other if you ask him. But the interrogator, having obtained the second premise by putting a question, should not make an additional question of what is evident, but should just state the conclusion, which Jesus has done here. Obviously, these two conversations differ from each other in many ways and include other aspects of dialogue as well. Yet the pattern is clearly there. As Dobb notes, this form is not so natural that it would be handled by anybody and anywhere. It does not occur in the Old Testament. These are not the only two examples either. In Luke 6, we see Jesus use this method to answer whether it's lawful to heal on the Sabbath. And both Mark and Luke have very similar accounts to Matthew of Jesus responding to questions of his authority. In other words, all three synoptic Gospels have examples of Jesus using the Socratic interrogation method. And to confirm its place in the context of the time and place Jesus ministered, we look at Quintilian, and we see what he said. He was a Latin rhetoric teacher in the first century, and we look at what he said about this. Quintilian says this: "The method of argument chiefly used by Socrates was this. When he had asked about a number of things to which his adversary could only agree, he finally drew the principal conclusion, as analogous to the points already conceded." Different teachers used this method in different ways. Generally, Socrates himself used this interrogation for the purpose not of meeting an attack, but of working out a thesis. Aristotle, on the other hand, used this often to squash an attack, to defeat his opponents. Quintilian primarily thought of this pattern as a dialectic philosophical scheme. So how did Jesus use the interrogation method? What was his purpose? In the question of Jesus' authority that we looked at in Matthew, Jesus certainly uses the method to challenge an attack against him, right? And he does so successfully. Given the audience of the chief priests and the teachers and the setting of the temple, I think we can agree that defeating their attack is the primary use of this method in the example in Matthew. But in Luke, there's a softer tone, right? Jesus is again challenging an attack on him, but here the attack is not asked outright. Jesus simply understands that the Pharisee is thinking this. Secondly, Jesus calls the Pharisee by name, right? There's certainly a more personal tone here. Third, Simon calls Jesus teacher. Fourth, we can't forget one of the overarching themes in Luke being that of Jesus ministering to the marginalized, and this narrative certainly lends itself to this theme. Finally, the interrogation is used as a means to teach one of Jesus' newest disciples. Jesus proclaims that she's saved in 750. Obviously, there's so much more to explore in this conversation, but Jesus uses the Socratic interrogation not just to clobber his opponent, but in order to teach about love, forgiveness, and faith. Jesus is discipling both Simon, who calls him a teacher in this narrative, and the forgiven woman. So let's conclude. The use of Socratic interrogation, while perhaps seemingly insignificant, demonstrates that both Rabbinic Judaism and Jesus utilized tools in Greek Hellenistic pedagogy. In the example that we looked at in Matthew, it's used to challenge an attack on Jesus and help those attacking him arrive at the conclusion themselves, asking a question. In the example we looked at in Luke, Socratic interrogation again responds to a challenge of Jesus' way of doing things. But it's also used to show both Simon and the woman Jesus' character. It's a lesson in discipleship. And so to end on a very practical note, what does Jesus' use of questions have to do with how we disciple today? Obviously, Jesus used many different methods. Socratic interrogation is simply a small part of how he taught. But Jesus asked a lot of questions. If I would ask you to write down the 10 most memorable things that Jesus said, my guess is that at least 9 of them, if not all 10, would be statements or propositions. There's nothing wrong with that. But asking questions was an integral part of Jesus' teaching method. Who do others say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Have you understood all these things? What do you want? Why do you call me good? These and many other questions are an integral part of Jesus' disciple-making method. So here's the question I want to leave us with today. How can we incorporate Jesus' tendency to ask questions into our disciple-making efforts? Thank you.